Almost sounds like you should expect something after that, doesn't it? Well, good morning. I'm Brad, and I'm glad to be home. Thank you for the many kind wishes and condolences you offered as I was with my family last weekend celebrating my uncle's life, who was really more a friend than an uncle. It's a wonderful thing to celebrate a life that's well lived. And after 52 years of multiple sclerosis, he woke up with a new body. What's that like, right? Yeah. Trev, thanks for filling in last minute and for not throwing me under the bus. Yeah. It's good to have 60 guys back with us who were on a summit retreat get-together last weekend. It was a wonderful weekend for them. Yeah. So the last couple of weekends, we've been talking about me and my big mouth, and Trev's done a great job with unpacking some things from the scripture that Jesus' biological brother James has written. One of the things that really struck for me was in the first week where he wrote, "Watch your mouth," with an asterisk. And, as a little kid, appropriately, so I was always told, watch your mouth, as if, watch what you say. But Trev turned that and asked the question, so does what you say reflect what's in your heart and your life? So, watch what you say. Monitor what you say. Think through, contemplate what you say. It just might be reflective of what's in your heart. In fact, Jesus would have agreed with that. Way to go, Trev. This is what he says in Luke chapter 6. He says, "A good person produces good things from the treasury of a good heart. And an evil person produces," this is strong language, evil person produces evil things from the treasury of an evil heart. What you say flows from what is in your heart. And so that's what we've been thinking about. Jesus wasn't a behavior modification guy. So he doesn't come along and go, okay, so here's what you can say and here's what you can't say. Stay within these bounds. Don't do these kinds of things. Don't say this. He had this idea that if human beings were to place their trust in him as God incarnate here on earth, and put their trust in what he did on Good Friday, where he gave his life to actually take care of all the indiscretions of our world and our life. And then on Sunday came back to life again as an idea that we could live a new life with him, a transformed life. And if someone would believe that, the interior motivations of their heart would be forever changed. And as they walk as followers, apprentices, and students of Jesus, they would see their worldview change, and they would, over time, increasingly think like him. And the more increasingly one thinks like Jesus, it affects your speech. It affects what you say. It affects how you say what you say. And this was Jesus' grand idea for humanity, that this is what he would do. Behavior modification has a lot of work tied to it and limited results. But when he transforms the inside of the human being and reshapes their thinking, what they say actually is transformed along that line. So that's Jesus. That's what his thought is. In the last couple of weekends, as I said, Trev's been looking at what Jesus' brother James had to say about it. This morning I want to look at what another person, another follower of Jesus has to say with him. Someone say about it. We're really familiar with this person. His name is Paul. In fact, we spent the better part of a summer looking at a letter that he wrote to some friends in the city of Philippi. And so without going into his background, he was a guy that experienced that transformation that Jesus offered up. He used to speak pretty bold, strong language against Jesus and against the church. And then he had the original Damascus experience, the Damascus Road experience, right? He's the originator of that. That's where that idea comes from. We use it as a colloquialism in our society, but that's where it came from. And he was blinded by the light. Not the 1976 song, but he was actually blinded by a light. The brilliant glory of Jesus. And in that moment, his soul and his heart are transformed, and now he becomes a speaker of good of Jesus. It just revolutionizes his language. Not only his language, but it sure comes out in his language. And this is Paul's experience. So he has some experience to speak about this subject matter. So the section I want to look at today is another letter that he wrote to another church, and this church is the church in Ephesus. A year ago this last summer, we spent time thinking through his letter to that church. So I want to take a section of it where he specifically addresses the mouth, the tongue, the words that we say. But he gives this wonderful word picture that I want to get to, but I want to read kind of the preamble to what he says, lay a little bit of a background for that word picture that he gives us. So if you want to follow along, we're going to go to the letter he writes to the church in Ephesus, chapter 4. I'm going to pick it up in verse 17. You can follow along on the screen if you want to. If you want to take your Bible out and write some things or make some notes in your tablet, you can do that as well. But this is what verse 17 says. It says, "With the Lord's authority, I say this, live no longer as Gentiles do, for they are hopelessly confused." Now, that's pretty strong language. It gets stronger as he goes through. He's pretty direct. So when Paul's writing to these friends in Ephesus, he's writing to Gentiles who weren't just people who were previously not followers of Jesus. They were Gentiles because they lived in a Greco-Roman culture. And he's telling them, don't live like you lived in that culture. You were part of the culture. You lived like someone in the culture. You accepted the values of that culture. But don't do that anymore, because something's changed inside of you. And by the way, do you remember you were hopelessly confused? So what is he referring to here? How was it that they changed in their thinking after they heard the story of Jesus? Well, this was a group of people who were spiritually confused. Just put yourself in their place. Historically, go back a couple of thousand years and think about this. There isn't a single solitary God. There's a pantheon of gods. There's Zeus and Poseidon, Apollos, Athena, Hermes, and so on. And these gods have sex together and they produce little baby gods, and those gods reproduce. There's so many gods that all have a separate function and ability, and kind of like superhero gods. There were practices of magic arts. Now, this is not Vegas magic. This is dark magic. Spirit world kind of magic was just a part of the culture. If you read how Paul comes into Ephesus and what happens, you'll read about the effects that his message had on that. And then you take this, Caesar, like Emperor Caesar declares himself to be God, divine. So he's God incarnate. So you have this pantheon of gods. You have a whole spirit world of gods going on. You have Caesar as God. And then you add to that a mountain of philosophies that all kind of took on a religious component to them. It's a spiritual stew that was confusing to the Ephesians. And so many homes had whole areas in their homes, sometimes entire rooms, set aside to icons and statues of various gods and spirits, because they didn't want to miss one. And it was really whatever you believe is good for you as long as it works for you. And into that, Paul says, remember that? Remember what it was like? Remember how hopelessly confused you were with that? So he's not being rude. He's not being judgmental. He's just trying to say, do you remember? To which they would have all gone, yeah, man, do we remember. We remember about confusion and hopelessness. We do. Verse 18 says, their minds are full of darkness. They wander far from the life of God that God gives, because they closed their minds and hardened their hearts against him. Hopelessly confused leads to closed minds and hard hearts. Verse 19, they have no sense of shame. They live in lustful pleasure and eagerly practice every kind of impurity. Remember, he's just trying to describe the culture that is currently existing, but that these folks were previously a part of. They carried values like might is right, and might was Roman citizenship. If you were a male, property-owning, naturally born Roman citizen, you were at the top of the food chain. If you didn't own land, or you were a female, or you weren't naturally born, you had far less rights. In fact, you may not even have had a chance to affect the political scene, or be an elder in the local pagan temple, or even become a landowner for that matter, because those that have might control their might, right? Worse yet, if your country or your tribe had been conquered by Rome, the best you could probably hope for is to be a slave and possibly get arrested for some traffic violation because you weren't one of them. There was racism, genderism, povertyism, if that is such a thing, and many other isms were just the norm in that culture. And Paul says, remember that day? Remember what that was like to live in that? There was the golden rule value. Those with the gold made the rules. Morality was relative. Well, Jesus followers often take delight in sending their teenage children off to a camp experience or a mission experience like we're going to do in Mexico in November. Ephesian parents thought it was best that their teenage daughters would spend a year serving the great temple of Artemis as a temple prostitute. Think about that, parents. Ladies, normal behavior might be for your husband to stop up at a gym on his way home, but what was normal behavior in Ephesus, your husband would stop off at Artemis's temple for a sexual encounter, all clouded in the cloak of this is a spiritual discipline. Can you imagine that one? Business negotiations were done with the assumption that other party were lying and deceiving, and that's just the basis under which we did it. So there was no trust in any kind of negotiations. And if you got trapped by someone's deception, it wasn't their problem, it was yours because you were weak and you didn't see it coming. Ephesus and other similar Greek cities were guarded by private security details that only the rich could afford. Violent crime was rampant in the city, and Paul's simply saying, remember that. Remember that was norm. That's where you came from. You remember that. And then he turns the corner in verse 20 and he says, but that is not what you learned from Christ. As much as that is the culture that we still live in, it is not the way you learned from Jesus Christ, remember? Since you have heard about Jesus, you have learned the truth that comes from him. In other words, to use another idea from Jesus, as much as you live in the culture, you don't have to be the same as the culture. As much as you live in a culture with a certain worldview, you don't have to have that worldview. Certain values, you don't have to have those values. You don't. You can live in that, but you don't have to give into it. In fact, there's a chance that the values of Jesus, remember Ephesians, the values of Jesus could actually transform your culture rather than the other way around where you're impacted by the culture around you. But this is a concern for Paul, that his Ephesian friends who once have said yes to Jesus and experienced the new life in him would leak back into what they had left behind that was hopelessly confusing to them. And he's concerned for them. He's painting a picture. This is true even for us as it comes to our words. We live in a nation where the tone from the highest places in government all the way through are tones of rancor and deception and lies and meanness, demeaning. We see it in Facebook posts, we see it on Twitter, it's across the board. But here's the thing, we don't have to participate in that. We actually could set a different model for the people around us, our family, our schools, our workplaces, where we don't participate in that. Remember, Ephesians, who you were. You're still in that culture, but you don't have to be like them. Your words can be different. You can set a different model. This is what Jesus would be teaching them with their words. Here's a sidebar, and this is for free. It's actually all for free, but this one's really for free. Whether you know Jesus or not, whether you think highly of him or you follow him, we should all be extremely grateful for this kind of lesson or thinking from Jesus and from Paul. You see, most of us just assume something in our culture. We assume that we all have individual rights and individual dignity, and the individual person really matters. We assume there's dignity for women and for children, for the poor. We assume that there's dignity for those that are health challenged and for the aged. We just assume dignity and respect for one another. We assume that abuse of any kind is wrong, emotional, physical, sexual. We just assume that. But did you know that it is a remnant of Christian thinking from the first century? And what happened in the first century through these kinds of ideas that Paul and Jesus spoke about, like the one we're talking about today, changed the culture of the first, second, and third century. You see, we assume that kind of dignity for all people. It's not so around the world. We're actually admired for that. A little less so in recent days. But we're admired because of the dignity we give every single human being. We learned that from Jesus. We did. This was not the experience of the Ephesians when they first met Jesus, but it became that. Let's go on. Verse 22. So this is a response. Throw off your sinful nature and your former way of life, which is corrupted by lust and deception. Instead, let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes, not change your behavior. Renew your thoughts and attitudes. Put on your new nature, created to be like God, truly righteous and holy. In other words, what Jesus is teaching them through Paul is that unlike other religions and contemporary views of culture, he's not trying to get them to change their behavior. He's actually working on the inside on this. And so now Paul turns the corner a little bit and he says, of all the ways that this might most profoundly affect you, it might just be in your speech. It could just be. This is what he says in verse 25. So as a result, if that's your experience, stop telling lies. Let us tell our neighbors the truth, for we are all parts of the same body. The longer we live with Jesus, the greater value we put on simply telling the truth. Unvarnished truth. The whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I spoke with someone recently who told me that when he was a little boy, he was a serial liar. He wouldn't have called himself that as a little boy, but looking back he was. He, as a little boy, chronically felt inferior to people, and he was shy by nature. So whenever he was kind of put on the spot with something, asked to come up with an answer for something, he would just reach back into whatever space in his head it was, and he would pull out some story. He would overstate some things, exaggerate. He would flat out make like amazing, fantastical stories, which everyone knew weren't true, right? But this was his safety mechanism for himself. He would tell lies about things that he had done or not done. He'd make up grand stories. And he told me, in fact, at one point, his dad was so concerned about his chronic lying that he had pulled him aside. This actually happens, I guess. Had taken a bar of soap and washed his mouth out. That's not just figuratively. He actually washed his son's mouth out with soap, thinking that somehow he had washed the lies out of his head. I don't know. Now, even as an adult, and this is where it came up for him, he said, that temptation still is there for me. That when I'm put on the spot, because I'm still that shy guy by temperament, and I still wonder about my value from time to time, the temptation sweeps back into my life, and I don't tell those like grotesque stories anymore. I can stop that. Not that the thoughts aren't there. But here's what I've discovered. That what I don't tell the truth in is the little nuance. Just the little shift of truth. That I know just a little bit more than what I really know about a subject matter. That the incident that I recite is a little more graphic than what it really is. And although there's been growth in my life, it's been that the spotlight of God's Spirit has been pointed in my life. To which I encouraged him. I said, that's such growth, that's wonderful. And yet, growth to what? Growth to increasingly tell the truth in all things. Lies break down relationships. Truth builds relationships. Verse 26 says, and don't sin by letting anger control you. Don't let the sun go down while you're still angry, for anger gives a foothold to the devil. Although this doesn't point directly to our words, seldom does anger get unaccompanied by words. It's there. Even hand and finger gestures are actually speaking. Yeah. Go on, verse 28 says, if you are a thief, quit stealing. Instead, use your hands for good, hard work, and then give generously to others in need. And then this. And this is the word picture I think Paul wants to emphasize. Verse 29 says, don't use foul or abusive language. Let everything you say be good and helpful, so that your words will be an encouragement to those who hear them. I actually prefer the New International Version. That's the New Living Version. Not because it's so much theologically more accurate or anything. It's what I memorized it in when I was a much younger person. And so I'm going to put that up on the screen. All right, here it is. It's the same verse, NIV. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths. I want to stop there for just a second and look at the word unwholesome. You don't really care what the Greek word is, but I'll just tell you what it means. It actually is taken from the idea of rotten fruit or rotten fish. So don't let any rotten fruit smell come out of your mouth in the form of your words. Don't let any rotten fish smell come out of your mouth in terms of your words. Pretty graphic, isn't it? That stuff stinks. Really does. Have you ever lived with anybody with chronic foot odor? That's what we're talking about. Have you ever lived with someone with unrelenting bad breath? Halitosis extremis. That's what we're talking about. Have you ever, when I was a boy, lived out in a rural setting, and every once in a while you would smell that sweet fragrance of a skunk in the neighborhood? He had emitted a fragrance to protect himself or herself, and it was rank and it was foul and it permeated everything, and danger was if you ever got squirted by the skunk. That was a whole process to get that out of your clothes and your body, your skin. It was rank, harmless in one sense, but rank. I mentioned I was away last weekend at my uncle's memorial. I got there late Thursday night and went right to bed, got up early the next morning, had a coffee and a breakfast sandwich, and then went about the activities of the day, barely eating anything throughout the day, though I did have a mid-afternoon coffee. The viewing with our family was from 4 p.m. to 7, and I joined in that, and it was wonderful to be with family and sit and talk. One of the guests at the memorial came and sat next to me, and she was kind of a lean-in speaker. You know, she was sitting at the edge of her chair, leaning in toward me. And she did most of the talking to start with, and then she asked me a question, and I responded. And almost immediately, she sat back in her chair. I didn't pay too much attention to it, so I kept talking about it, telling my story, till finally she did this. And then I realized I had bad breath. Like really bad breath. Now I could taste it myself, right? Is this gross or what? So I reached over for the dish of mince, and the rest of the evening I ate mince. Because I was self-conscious. I was aware that this was not a good fragrance. And I couldn't do anything about it right then other than suck on some mince. Don't let any bad breath language come out of your mouth. Be aware of it. Be uncomfortable with it is another way that you could say this. Unwholesome talk is anything that is distasteful. Broad category. Broad category. It's things like gossip. That stuff stinks. It does. Rumors. Triangulating, as Trev said it last week. Deception, criticism, mocking, innuendo, disrespect, too much talking, not enough listening, denigration, blame. Maybe the worst one is condemnation. These are all things that stink. They're rancid. They're rotten. I mentioned the skunk thing. I kind of like the imagery of the fragrance left by a skunk. So maybe this week, this is going to help us watch our unwholesome, stinky talk. Skunk mouth. Yeah, so let's help one another in our church family, okay? So this next week, you can try this at work as well. I think you can get that image off of Google Images. This next week, here in our church family, maybe your own family, maybe at work, whenever someone gossips, whenever somebody says something maligning about somebody else, whenever there's unfair criticism, whenever there's lying, whenever there's just lovingly lean over and go, skunk breath, skunk mouth. That's what it is. See what happens. If they've never heard that idea before, you have a chance to explain what it is all about. Let no unwholesome talk come out of your mouth. The second half of the verse says this, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. The only words that should come across our lips, because we are followers of Jesus the Christ, are words that build other people up according to their needs so that they benefit from what we say. Isn't that a great idea? Yeah. Hey, let's be honest. It sounds like a really nice way to talk, doesn't it? It sounds like something really nice. It almost sounds soft and gentle. Sounds like a kind of a painted-on Christian thing. to do. But can you actually live like that? Can you parent like that? Can you work in an aggressive work environment, in a competitive school environment? Can you play on a team and actually every word that comes out of your mouth is filled with grace and goodness and kindness and niceness? Can you imagine parenting like this? Your 16-year-old teenage daughter comes home and says, does not ask, because that's what they do, they say, she's going to the prom with Cody. Now, Cody's the boy of your nightmare. He has that reputation. You're terrified for your daughter, but you're so committed to being a parent whose words are always building and kind and nice. So you go, oh, how wonderful. Please be careful and have a good evening. Are you kidding me? Cody ain't taking her out. No way, unless we're double dating. Your mom and dad are going with you. No, you don't do that. Imagine the annual review time of your work and your response to an employee who's underperforming and not meeting deadlines is to say, I'm so grateful that you show up 80% of the time. No, that's not, no, here. Paul is not talking about niceness. That's not what this is about. He's talking about building up. He's talking about being helpful. He's not trying to be nice, nor is he suggesting being nice is the same as building up. Sometimes building up words are corrective and guiding and actually restrict what the other person can do. It's not about being nice. It's about being helpful. For who? For the other person. Sometimes being helpful is to say hard things that don't feel nice for either party. It's often the tone with which the helpful words come. That's the matter, it's the tone. So some of us need to say some helpful things by dialing down the tone, while others of us need to muster up the courage to simply say the helpful words rather than fume about it behind the scenes of niceness. And then Paul gives us this guiding idea to the words and tones that we can best use. He uses a construction term. He says building up, build up. In a few weeks, we're going to start construction on adding some new parking spots, some offices, some much-needed kid space, along with a coffee shop and a fantastic building dedicated to the Center of the Arts. Over the next 6 months or so, everyone who comes onto this campus has one objective. That's to build up. Each day, the thing that they're adding to is the beauty and functionality of this building. You show up with a wrecking ball, you're on the wrong side. We're here to build up as the other person needs for their benefit. Paul is suggesting that our words are construction material and they have the power to add to the beauty and functionality of those we use them on. So, when you leave the construction site or the interaction with them, they're actually better off for having been with you. They're better off for having been with you. Can you imagine a family where the only words that are spoken to one another are building up words to help one another for their benefit? Be a really quiet Thanksgiving, right? Imagine a place of work where everybody just builds each other up. Imagine a church family, a school, where all that crosses our lips are words that build one another up. And just so we don't misunderstand what Paul is saying here, he adds these important guidelines. You do it according to the other person's needs and for their benefit. You know how we do this, or at least we want to do it at times. Someone in our view does something wrong or disappoints us and makes a mistake, and we correct them with an edge in our tone. After all, we're just building them up so that they don't do it again, right? When in actual fact, we just need and want to be right because it feels good to be right. But Paul says, check that. Check your heart on that. The gauge is not if building them up is for your need, benefit, or righteousness. It's about building them up for their need and for their benefit. So, here's a great place to start. It's a practical application, if you will. It's a spiritual practice. It's memorizing Ephesians 4:29. So I'm going to put it back up again, and I'm going to time you and me how long it takes to do this. Okay? So when I count down from 3, just read it in a casual voice. We'll read it together. Here we go. You ready? All right. 3, 2, 1. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. How long did that take? 12.86 seconds. Do you think there's a chance in conversations that you would have this week that you could pause for 12.86 seconds? Is there a chance you could do that? Like, maybe not always, but could you just give me a minute? No, just give me 12.86 seconds. And you memorize that. And now you're not changing behavior. You're doing a behavior to get that into our hearts and our heads, so that the pause is something that actually works through our souls. And then say what you want to say from that. I think it might affect what you say from there. A practical way. This is what Paul is suggesting. Put it in your heart. Let it affect you. Say only that which builds other people up. I want to finish with this. Every communicator loves to have an airplane story. And I have an airplane story for you. I flew home from Toronto this last Monday night, and I flew through Houston. And I was in seat 29F. That's the window seat almost at the tail wing. It's way back there. I took my seat next to a woman who had boarded with the physical restriction folks. She had a cane and some issues with her knees, and so she had gone in early. So I kind of crawled over top of her to get to my seat. She was in the middle seat. And very quickly, as I sat there, she started up a conversation with me. She asked if I was coming or going. And I said, I'm both. I said, I'm coming back and I'm going home, which she thought was not clever at all. But that's okay. So I said, and you? She said, well, I'm going to Mesa. It's my home. Where are you coming from? Coming from Branson, Missouri. I said, wow, what took you to Branson, Missouri? And she says, well, the True Legends Conference. Have you heard of it? I said, I've never heard of it. What is it? Well, that opened the door to an amazing conversation. You see, the True Legends Conference is about transhumanism and the hybrid age. Do you know what that is? I hadn't really thought about that either until she talked about it, but I did a quick Google and I found out what it is. It's the $6 million man becoming reality. It's superhuman machines combined with artificial limbs and intelligence that are connected with the human body. And ultimately, the fear that she was learning about was that these new superhumans would take over the world. And it was an ominous idea for her to consider that. She got my attention. I was going to say something about Darth Vader, but something stopped me. You know what stopped me? Do not say anything unwholesome, but only that which builds others up according to their need, so it'll benefit those who listen. You see, I was thinking ahead to this weekend, but it was right there. She asked if I was afraid of this impending doom that she had spoken about, because she told me about some other things. Over the next 30 minutes, she told me about vapor trails in the sky, contrails. She said they're not actually water. They're the dark government seeding the sky with chemicals to block infrared ray from getting to our solar panels. We talked a little more about such topics as 9/11 never really happening, or it was done by the same dark government forces to create a reason to invade Iraq and Afghanistan. And we talked about Wi-Fi poisoning. What's that? Well, she explained it to me. In fact, she was wearing a full-length poncho with a hood that she explained was infused with metal alloys to block Wi-Fi from getting into her body. At one point in the lull in our conversation, she took her phone and started to read something, a document or something on her phone, and she unfurled a veil that was hidden in the hood to come down in front of her phone so that the Wi-Fi waves wouldn't get to her as she was on her phone. I had other science fiction ideas I wanted to share. At one point, we re-engaged in the conversation and a question came to my mind. I asked her, does all this knowledge of these harmful elements in our world and conspiracy ideas, does it make you afraid? She said, it's more complicated than that. Yeah, I am afraid. But also people really, really need to know about this. They really need to know. She said, are you afraid? I said, well, I don't know exactly how to say this to you, but I believe that there is somebody who loves this world more than you and I can ever imagine. And he's not prone to conspiracies. He's not prone to conjecture. He doesn't get deceived. And he's good all the time. And this world and the people in this world are the apple of his eye. And he knows your name. And he cares deeply about you. And you matter to him. And so I live pretty much a fear-free life. And I think he would want you, go ahead and study the information. But he really would like you to rest in his personal care for you too. It ended the conversation. And I don't know whether she was upset with me for saying that or she was thinking about it. I just know that in that moment I learned a lesson from this verse. Respect her and say only that which would build her up. Could I have corrected her? You bet I could have. But in that moment, it didn't seem like the thing to do. Could I have mocked her? I've got a dark enough heart, that was there. But in the end, I learned the power of this verse that Paul gives us. You know what else I know? I accidentally sat not in seat 29F, I accidentally sat in 30F. And I would not otherwise have sat with her. I don't know what that means, but I know what I learned. So here's the application. Memorize Ephesians 4:29 this week. Would you do that? Please? Not for me, for yourself. And then consider what you say. Nothing unwholesome, only that which builds other people up according to their need, so it benefits those who listen. King Jesus, thank you for your patient, lesson-giving kindness. You don't run over top of us and demand of us, but oh, how you profoundly prompt us. I thank you that for those that have said yes to you, you're not just a voice in the ethereal world, but you're present inside of us by your Spirit. And oh, how you work, don't you, Spirit, to guide our thinking so that our conversation is building. That people are better as a result of conversations with us than they would have if they hadn't had conversations with us. But Jesus, the truth is we get frustrated and we get angry and we get impatient, and that's a heart problem. And so do the work in our hearts that would honor you, that in some way people would increasingly think we just might be a little like you, and they too would put their trust in you, Christ.